What if the part of you that's most silent is also the part that's most dangerous? Not to others, to yourself. Most people think they're in control, but behind their decisions, their reactions, their exhaustion, there's something older operating, something buried, a part of the self that was told to shut up, calm down, fit in, and so it did. And now, you feel tired for no reason, angry without a cause, afraid to take up space, not because you're broken, but because you've been trained to fear your own power. This video is not about fixing you. It's about unmasking the systems, internal and external, that benefit from your self-abandonment. You'll understand how shadow work isn't therapy, it's exposure, and why most people will never truly change, not because they can't, but because they're addicted to the safety of being incomplete. You'll discover how psychological projection silently shapes your relationships, your career, and your identity. And you'll be shown, step by step, how to reclaim the parts of you that have been rejected, shamed, or buried, not by accident, but by design. This isn't a motivational speech. It's a confrontation with what you've been avoiding. Because the real question isn't, what's holding you back? The real question is, who taught you to fear the person you'd become if you stopped hiding? Most people aren't afraid of failure. They're afraid of what would happen if they stopped hiding. There's a strange terror that creeps in when you begin to imagine yourself powerful, assertive, unapologetically creative. It's not just fear, it's resistance. The kind of resistance that shows up when someone compliments you and you shrink. When you have an idea in a meeting, but don't speak. When you feel anger, but call it stress. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not because it's evil, but because it's hidden. And too often, what we hide isn't weakness. It's the very part of us that could save our lives. Especially for those raised in homes where keeping quiet was rewarded, or in jobs where obedience is mistaken for virtue, the shadow becomes a vault where your true voice is locked away. You were likely taught that certain traits were bad. Anger was dangerous, confidence was arrogance, ambition was selfish, so you buried them, hoping to be accepted. And now you walk around exhausted, trying to be kind, patient, humble, while suppressing the fire inside. This is where shadow work begins, not with fixing what's broken, but reclaiming what's been buried. Take a working mother who never learned to say no. Society applauds her sacrifice, but inside she's burnt out, bitter, and resentful. What if her anger isn't a flaw, but a signal? A compass pointing back to her boundaries, her identity, her strength. Jung believed that suppressed traits, when reintegrated, could transform you. What you thought was rage might be leadership. What looked like jealousy might be suppressed desire to create. The parts you hide might be the parts you need most. Most people avoid their shadow because they assume it's ugly, but Jung shattered that myth. Your shadow contains inner strength, intuition, and even genius. These are parts of your psyche that were simply not safe to express when you were younger. Maybe you were laughed at for speaking up. Maybe being too passionate got you punished. Over time, you learned to dim your light, not because it was wrong, but because the room you were in couldn't handle it. But what if the you that you've locked away is the most authentic version you've ever known? One of the greatest tragedies is mistaking repression for humility. There's nothing noble about shrinking to fit someone else's comfort zone. True humility is owning your power and choosing to use it wisely. That can only happen when you stop fearing your own intensity and begin to integrate it consciously. Your unconscious mind doesn't forget. It stores every rejection, every shame-triggering moment, every time your truth was too loud for the room. That's why shadow work can be so emotionally intense. You're not just discovering who you are, you're facing who you were told not to be. Imagine a teenage boy growing up in a working-class home where expressing sadness is met with, "Man up." Over time, he disconnects from vulnerability, becoming emotionally numb. As an adult, this becomes a wall in his relationships. But when he finally gives himself permission to cry, he unlocks not just grief, but empathy, connection, and self-awareness. The same thing happens in you. The parts of yourself you suppress don't disappear. They just go dark. And when they're left in the dark too long, they come back louder, through anxiety, burnout, and emotional shutdown. Here's the twist. What you label as emotional triggers might actually be signs of life. They're not your enemies. They're your shadow knocking at the door. That rush of envy when someone else speaks with confidence. It might be the echo of your silenced voice. That irritation you feel toward someone who sets boundaries. It could be your own desire for respect, buried under years of people-pleasing. The discomfort you feel isn't dysfunction. It's direction. It's the beginning of a personal growth process. Jung didn't invite us to destroy the shadow, but to dialogue with it. He believed that wholeness only begins when we stop dividing ourselves into good and bad and start listening to what each part of us is trying to say, especially the parts that hurt to hear. In low-income jobs or environments of constant survival, there's no time to reflect. You learn to function, not to feel. But shadow work isn't a luxury for the privileged. It's a necessity for the oppressed. When you reclaim your shadow, you stop being controlled by shame. You stop being emotionally manipulated by employers, partners, or systems that rely on your silence. A construction worker who learns to express his anger healthily doesn't just become emotionally balanced, he becomes unbreakable. A waitress who owns her suppressed ambition may finally leave a toxic job to start something of her own. These aren't just mindset shifts, they're existential revolutions. Reclaiming your power isn't just self-care. It's an act of spiritual defiance in a world that profits from your submission. But this isn't easy. The shadow resists exposure. You may feel guilt for wanting more, fear for setting limits, or shame for saying no. That's part of the process. Your ego will cling to the old identity, the self that got you praise for playing small. That's why Jung said, the individuation process requires moral courage. You're not just peeling back layers, you're facing the fear of being fully seen. And yet, in that rawness, there is freedom. Because once you face your shadow, nobody can use it against you. Nobody can guilt you for being assertive when you've owned your anger. Nobody can shame your dreams when you've accepted your ambition. The parts of you that once felt dangerous become sacred. And that's when healing begins. Shadow work doesn't end in the mirror. It begins there. You'll start to notice patterns, the relationships that drain you, the jobs that silence you, the habits that keep you numb. And suddenly, you'll start making different choices. Not because you're trying to be someone else, but because you've stopped abandoning who you already are. The goal isn't perfection, it's integration. To live without constantly editing yourself, without apologizing for your strength, without hiding your real voice. And the deeper you go, the more you'll realize that your shadow was never the enemy. It was your wounded self waiting to be reclaimed. What part of yourself have you been taught to hide? Share in the comments what strength you've been afraid to own. You don't always hate what's wrong in others. Sometimes, you hate what's repressed in yourself. That's the brutal truth behind psychological projection, one of Carl Jung's most powerful ideas. Most people think their judgments are justified. But what if the qualities you attack in others are actually disowned parts of your own psyche? Jung believed that what we refuse to accept in ourselves, we unconsciously place on others. That coworker you call arrogant, that neighbor you think is too sensitive, that influencer you mock for being fake, they might be reflecting back to you the very traits you were never allowed to express. And until you make that unconscious dynamic conscious, you'll keep fighting shadows that look like people. Projection shows up in everyday life more often than we notice. You snap at your partner for being too emotional, when deep down you've spent years suppressing your own feelings. You get irritated by someone's confidence, because you were shamed every time you tried to speak up. You call others lazy, because rest was never a right. It was a sin. In working-class environments where survival is priority, there's often no space to explore nuance. Emotions get labeled, people get boxed in, and so the mind protects itself by blaming others. Projection is not evil. It's a defense mechanism, a survival reflex, but it becomes dangerous when it stays unconscious, because then every relationship becomes a battlefield, and the enemy is always out there. One of the clearest signs of projection is an exaggerated emotional reaction. You don't just feel annoyed, you feel enraged. You don't just notice someone's behavior, you obsess over it. That intensity is the signal. It's your unconscious saying, "This matters. Look here." Imagine a man who grew up being told that showing vulnerability is weakness. As an adult, he finds himself disgusted by anyone who cries in public. Not because he's cruel, but because their openness confronts the part of him he's buried. This is why emotional triggers are gold for shadow work. They're not random, they're roadmaps. Every time something gets under your skin, it's an invitation to ask, what part of myself am I refusing to face? But projection doesn't just apply to negative traits. It also explains why you idolize some people to the point of obsession. That artist you admire for their courage? That friend who seems to speak so freely? Those traits might exist in you, in dormant form. Jung called this positive projection. When you assign greatness to others, forgetting that it might be your own potential, still waiting for permission. This is why envy hurts. Not because you want to take what they have, but because deep down, you know you could have it too, if you stopped hiding. Projection, in both directions, reveals what's unresolved, and until it's owned, it owns you. The danger of projection is that it distorts reality. You're no longer seeing others for who they are. You're reacting to them through the lens of your own shadow. This destroys relationships. A partner's need for space feels like rejection. A child's independence feels like disrespect. A colleague's boundary feels like a personal attack. And yet, none of those reactions are about the other person. They're echoes from within. This is why Jung warned that people spend their lives fighting their own reflection. But once you spot the pattern, you reclaim power. You stop needing others to change and start focusing on what needs healing inside. Imagine how many conflicts in families come from projection. A mother who criticizes her daughter's independence may be mourning the freedom she never claimed. A father who mocks his son's creativity may be grieving his own abandoned dreams. These aren't villains. They're wounded adults, projecting their unrealized lives onto the people they love. And unless they become conscious of it, they pass that pain down, like an invisible inheritance. That's why this work is urgent. Self-awareness isn't self-indulgent. It's intergenerational healing. Every time you take responsibility for a reaction, you're breaking a cycle. Every time you pause before blaming, you're shifting the narrative. For people in stressful, low-control environments, like minimum wage jobs, toxic households, or communities without safe space for expression, projection becomes a reflex. There's no time for introspection when you're surviving. But that's exactly why it matters. When you live in a system that gaslights your instincts, projection keeps you trapped in a loop of self-sabotage. You lash out, isolate, and repeat patterns that hurt you more than anyone else. But once you begin to recognize these patterns, something shifts. You go from reaction to reflection, from blame to responsibility, from fragmentation to personal growth. And in that shift, you rediscover your agency. Spotting projection isn't about blaming yourself for everything. It's about taking back control of your inner world. Because once you realize that not every offense is personal, not every trigger is truth, and not every irritation is about the other, you get your clarity back. You stop giving your power to the people who provoke you. You start asking deeper questions. What does this say about me? What am I being shown here? And those questions lead you somewhere sacred, somewhere uncomfortable but honest. And just beyond that discomfort lies something even more confronting. What if your shadow isn't just a wound, but a weapon, waiting to be turned inward or outward? Who in your life triggers you the most? And what might that say about you? Drop your reflections below. Let's decode the mirrors together. Healing isn't just about feeling better. Sometimes it's about burning down the lie you were forced to live. Shadow work isn't a self-help trend. It's an act of inner rebellion. Because once you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you were taught to hide, you start to dismantle the very systems that benefit from your silence. That's why this work feels so hard. You're not just healing your inner child, you're unlearning generations of fear, guilt, and control. Jung called this process the integration of the shadow, but in truth, it's much more than integration. It's spiritual insurgency. And for those raised in environments where obedience meant survival, reclaiming your shadow is the first real taste of freedom. In societies shaped by power, projection, and repression, the collective shadow grows in silence. Cultures that glorify productivity will demonize rest. Families that worship strength will shame vulnerability. Communities that equate goodness with compliance will ostracize rebellion. And so the individual absorbs the message. Suppress your truth to stay safe. But what happens when millions do this at once? We normalize injustice. We spiritualize suffering. We romanticize exhaustion. Shadow work, then, becomes revolutionary because it pulls back the curtain. It reveals that what we call normal might be a mass projection, a cultural wound disguised as virtue. And the moment you stop internalizing that narrative, you begin to rewrite it. That's why Jung didn't just speak of personal healing. He spoke of moral courage. Because true self-awareness forces you to confront the structures that shaped your suffering. A woman who reclaims her assertiveness isn't just finding her voice, she's resisting a system that taught her to be silent. A man who faces his grief isn't just healing emotionally, he's challenging generations of masculine stoicism that turned pain into shame. This is the real heart of shadow work, seeing the ways your pain was conditioned by collective patterns, and choosing not to pass it on. Every time you face your own darkness, you remove one brick from the wall of cultural numbness. You want to heal the world? Start by looking at what you project onto it. That's not a metaphor, it's a method. Because the unconscious mind doesn't just shape your relationships, it shapes your worldview. A person who denies their own fear will demand certainty from everyone else. A leader who represses shame will enforce punishment to avoid vulnerability. And a society that disowns its history will repeat it, disguised in new language. Jung called this the collective shadow, and said it must be acknowledged to avoid catastrophe. That's why your personal shadow work matters. It scales. When one person becomes conscious, their presence changes the field around them. In low-income neighborhoods, working-class jobs, and high-stress environments, shadow work isn't optional. It's survival. Because when external systems are broken, your internal system must be strong. Not hardened, but integrated. A nurse working double shifts who learns to recognize her guilt as a byproduct of burnout, not moral failure, regains sovereignty. A factory worker who understands his emotional numbness as trauma response, not laziness, begins to reclaim his capacity to feel. These are not small wins. They are inner strength in action. When you understand your shadow, you no longer confuse fatigue with weakness or anger with failure. You gain language. You gain clarity. You gain choice. But make no mistake, this journey isn't soft. It asks you to feel what you spent a lifetime avoiding. It demands that you question the authority figures who taught you to hide. It forces you to admit that your silence served someone else's comfort. That's why this work is spiritual warfare, not against others, but against the conditioned self. The self that clings to suffering because it's familiar. The self that sabotages growth to avoid abandonment. The self that calls repression discipline because freedom is terrifying. But in the words of Jung, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain is not punishment, it's passage. And through that passage, something miraculous happens. You stop asking permission to be whole. You stop negotiating your truth. You begin to live not as a fragmented self, but as a sovereign being. Not because you're perfect, but because you've stopped editing your soul to please others. Shadow work then ceases to be inner work. It becomes your presence in the world. Your relationships change. Your energy shifts. You walk differently, speak differently. You move from reaction to intention, from shame to vision, from survival to purpose. This is not self-improvement. It's self-liberation. And it starts the moment you decide that your pain will no longer be your prison. But before you can integrate your shadow fully, there's one more truth you must face. Perhaps the hardest of all, that the part of you you've been trying to fix was never broken. It was buried. And your job now is not to punish it, but to listen. Not to control it, but to partner with it. That's when healing becomes wholeness. And from that wholeness, a different future begins. What belief or behavior have you inherited that no longer serves you? Comment below the one thing you're ready to unlearn, for good. You were never meant to live in pieces. The more you reject, the more you fracture. But the more you accept, even what scares you, the more you come home to yourself. That is the paradox of shadow work. What you've been running from is often the thing you need most. Now you've seen what's hidden beneath your reactions. You've questioned the judgments you place on others. You've learned how society profits from your silence and how wholeness is the ultimate rebellion. But knowledge means nothing if it stays in your head. So ask yourself right now, what part of you do you still treat like an enemy? What reaction, pattern, or relationship is asking for your attention? And what small act of courage could you take today to stop projecting and start integrating? Write it down, speak it out loud, or better, live it. This journey isn't easy, but it's yours. And if even one layer of shadow has lifted for you today, let that be your sign. You are already changing. You don't need to become someone else. You need to remember who you were before they taught you to hide. If this message hit home, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon. This is just the beginning. There's more to uncover, and together, we'll keep walking toward the light behind the shadow.